Okay, Sarah, take it.
Yes. All right. One launch of Dr. Calla Wiemer's book titled Macroeconomics for Emerging Asia. I am Sarah Daway-Ducanes, Associate Professor at the UP School of Economics, or UPSE, and currently seconded at the National Economic Development Authority. And it is my honor and pleasure to serve as this session's moderator. This book, Macroeconomics for Emerging Asia, has been long awaited. It has been long in the making, but its coming now is very timely, especially with what's happening all over the world. So just by way of introducing our panel of presenters, discussants, our main presenter, of course, is the book's author, Dr. Calla Wiemer. Now, Dr. Calla Wiemer arrived at the UPSE in 2015 with the manuscript for this textbook halfway written. Teaching macroeconomics and history of economic thought at UPSE, she used her classroom discussions as an opportunity to develop the book students with her ideas, and in the process, clarifying her own ideas further. Said that very valuable ground for her to develop this textbook. Now, before UPSE, Calla taught at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and the National University of Singapore. She is currently the president of the American Committee on Asian Economic Studies, and in this capacity moderates the Asian Economics blog. As a member of the U.S. National Business Economics Issues Council, she briefs corporate economists about conditions in Asia. She also served as editor of the Journal of Asian Economics from 2015 to 2020. Now, she is bicontinental with homes in LA and in Manila. Now, she will be briefly presenting her book, and then this will be followed by discussions from former UPSE students. The first of which will be Carlo Asuncion, chief economist at the Union Bank, Philippine Economic Society Board of Trustees. This will be followed by Eslava-Jimenez, Policy Research Officer 3 at the Philippine Competition Commission, and then by Levi Geganzo, was previously part of the Center for Integrated and Development Studies Political Economy Program, and currently a researcher at the Ateneo School of Government. Then we'll have Dan Jimenez, senior economist at the National Irrigation Administration and a senior lecturer at the University of the Philippines Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga. And last but not the least, we have J.C. Punongbayan, a well-known author at Rappler and assistant professor and graduate director of the University of the Philippine School of Economics. Further,
I'd like to thank Sarah for moderating this panel, and profound thanks to all of the students who sat through this course and helped me develop the book, and especially to those 5 who are here today to kind of reminisce about our time together. Before I jump in, we have one student, Carlo, a former student. Now, all of these people are clearly advancing in their careers and leading very busy lives. And so I'm glad they're taking time to be here. One in particular needs to depart early, Carlo. And so he's going to jump in here first of all. And I'm going to say that this is reminiscent of Carlo's behavior in the classroom. He always sat right in front, and he was often speaking up with questions and comments, and I appreciated that then, and I appreciate his. Let's turn.
Oh, I never thought it's gonna be this early. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Wiemer, and everyone. Good afternoon, and to our moderator, secretary, sorry, USEC, assistant secretary. Sorry, you might be saying the wrong position, but the former secretary of PS Board of Trustees, Sarah Ducanes. No, but let me start by saying that just this textbook is really welcome. No, and because it does take into account the peculiarities, the different characteristics. I mean, differing from particularly the advanced economies. No, no. The first time I did, as mentioned, encounter this uh, draft of book was when I was in her class, Dr. Wiemer's class, no, and I appreciated that. We got bits and pieces of the book every time, every single time we had class, and it really piqued my interests, and that's why I just kept on talking and talking about it, asking questions, no? And not to mention that macroeconomics is one of my favorite subjects. And but I'd like to talk about it's a short one, two parts of it that are very close to, I would say, either my research interest or basically just my heart. No? And one of which is the business cycles part of the Hyman Minsky was mentioned. Now, I mean, Hyman Minsky, I think, is one of the most, uh, I'd say, forgettable because they rarely mentioned him before 2008, you know, and appreciated the fact that when he had his moment in 2008, um, it was sadly posthumous, but I'm glad that it's actually there, and how Minsky uh, was fitted into the experience of the Philippines, no? By Dr. Wiemer, and that for me is a great addition to the discussion. No, when the discussion is uh, uh, ensues, particularly this chapter. Um, Chapter is the macroprudential policy chapter. Uh, Again, this is a special place in my research interest. If you have the time, you can check it out. You can access it. Just type along on the ADB website, Carlo Asuncion name. You'll find the effectiveness of macroprudential policies, particularly in Asia. No? So this is in line with our research that we did. No? And how these particular policies, these macroprudential policies, were very Asia specific, no, and particularly during the Great Recession or the global financial crisis. And it did well how these particularly macroprudential policies now be of economies. I mean, fast forward to now, you know, post pandemic, um, especially now that the current rising interest rates or monetary policy tools are particularly on interest rates are now or actually can derail, or if not already, the intended bounce back of emerging economies from COVID-19, you know, and of course the other surprises, or one real estate consultant that I've talked to recently, one of the 15 storms that the world is facing. You know, but overall, okay, let me just try to bring this home because I have to jump to another presentation. Overall, if I were to teach again, given a I will readily use this book as one of the references in any either intro to macro or intermediate macroeconomics course, and be able to use it as a basis for discussions. And yeah, and that overall, that's my impression, and I'm just grateful to be able to at least give my thoughts about it, my 2 cents. And once again, thank you so much for Dr. Carlo Wiemer, and for being part of my learning experience, particularly in macroeconomics. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Carlo. I'll presenting your book now, Carlo.
Yes, I will provide an introduction now that we've lost Carlo, and we'll then move on to the other discussants. So let's move through the slides. Using US macro texts, what do you get? And that US macro texts are the norm throughout emerging East Asia. They're the norm. They are very specific to the US economy and not terribly applicable beyond that. Nevertheless, that's what people use. So with the US textbook, you get no concern for external balance, no concern for the exchange rate, no concern for government. None of US textbooks or US macroeconomists, really, if they're looking at the United States. Stabilization policy is focused on inflation and unemployment. That, again, that works fine in the US context. And if the governor of the central bank is giving an address and taking questions from the press, inevitably someone will ask about the exchange rate and he'll say, that's not part of our mandate. Next question. It simply doesn't register with them. Even the unemployment rate is not much use as an indicator in the emerging market setting. It's hard to measure unemployment meaningfully in a context where there's a large subsistence agricultural population, a large informal economy. An unemployment rate is not a very good gauge of economic potential or the level of economic activity. So that doesn't transfer from the US. And finally, the US has wide open policy space that comes from having the world's reserve currency, from having a mature, globally dominant financial system responsive to a policy rate of interest, and basically unlimited access to credit, even when the US behaves badly, as it did by launching the global financial crisis. Nevertheless, global capital all flowed to the US, and the US had no circumstance. On all of these grounds, US macro textbooks are just not a very good fit for what we need to do in the emerging East Asia setting. So here's a cover shot of my book. And this looks familiar to me because it's what I see directly out the window in front of me, although it's not sunrise right now, but I am looking directly at the Sierra Madre Mountains from my apartment on Katipunan Avenue, Berkeley Residences. And I took this photo, a sunrise over the Sierra Madre, and it really is kind of jogs my memories of how I start the day, although not every day is as spectacular as this particular sunrise. When I posted this cover on Facebook, somebody who follows me, anybody who follows me knows that I do a lot of biking in the Manila. I take that on my bicycle. And I said, no, but it certainly is a tribute to my biking domain. And that's what I see when I look out there. A coffee table type cover for this book, even if you don't want to read it, it's going to be a beautiful book to have sitting around. The economies covered in the book are 13: Cambodia, China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Korea, Laos, Myanmar, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. But to the extent that data are available, and for some of these economies, particularly Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, there's not a lot of data available, so they drop out of a lot of the analysis, and we're down to 10 for the most part. Now, Sarah is right that this book has had a very long gestation period, and I have to admit to that, but gone on. Meantime, the start really dates back to the National University of Singapore. I taught there in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for 2 years, 2006 to 2008, and was charged with teaching macroeconomics in a master's level course, kind of similar to the MDE course that I taught at UPSE. And a textbook, standard US textbook, had been chosen for me, and I felt like for that student population, which was mainly from all across Asia, that it was just really inappropriate, that they were not getting a version of macroeconomics that would be at all useful to them in their own countries. The National University of Singapore, the School of Public Policy, then charged two of us, a colleague named Charles Adams, and developing an executive program to be taught in Vietnam. And fortunately for me, Charles Adams was a retired macroeconomist after a career at the IMF, and he really knew exactly how to put together a course. So with his brilliant insights on how to restructure macroeconomics for the Asian context, we put this course together and we each taught it in Vietnam a couple of times. And he really mentored me in learning how to think about macroeconomics for Asia and put together a well-organized course on the subject. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to co-author this book with me, although he was quite agreeable to it, and I had to carry on without him, but he did provide all of the thrust. Drew knowledge. About the same time, China was taking a lot of heat for its exchange rate policy. So this was the mid to late 2000s, and I thought it was really undeserved. I was a fan of China's exchange rate policy. I thought they were doing exactly what they should be doing. And so I wrote a series of op-eds for the Wall Street Journal in support of China's exchange rate policy. And over a period of years, different editorial page editors handled my op-ed pieces. And finally, there was one who said to me, "Does anybody else agree with what you think?" And that struck me as another sign that there needed to be a textbook. Somebody really needed to lay out the foundations for thinking about exchange rate policy in the Asian context. Understood it. And so that was also a motivator. So I got the book about half written by 2015, and that was when I arrived at UPSC and was allowed to teach the courses that I really most wanted to teach in the book. So the MDE macro course, and the book really follows in full what I see as being essential for that course. But I also taught thought course. And I felt like to write a book on macroeconomics, I really needed to delve into the origins of ideas on macroeconomics. And so teaching that course gave me an opportunity to do that. And of course, when you teach something, that's the best way to learn it. And so I was learning in the process of teaching that course. And a lot of that material is incorporated into my book. And the chapter Carlo mentioned, where I felt like, and others have said too, it's only by looking at long-term history and the motivation for thinking about business cycles only comes over long spans of time. If we have a smooth period of many decades, like we pretty much did in the post-World War II, you could even say post-Great Depression era, up until 2008, there were fluctuations, but there was not a financial crisis in the United States for many, many decades. So that kind of thinking about the extremes of business cycles really fell off the radar. So I have continued to work on the book. I taught it in Korea at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management in 2019. And then really with COVID. So features of the book. Well, both internal and external balance matter for macroeconomic stability. Trade shocks, volatile capital flows, those are really important for stabilization, thinking about stability and stabilization policy in the Asian context. And they get no attention whatsoever in a US macro textbook. The exchange rate and the interest rate work in tandem as policy instruments. And policy space is constrained. Fiscal policy requires attention to debt sustainability. What is the level of debt to GDP, and how does the policy stimulus increase debt, and how constrained an economy is by their debt level, and thinking forward about where they're headed. And monetary policies influenced by global capital flows, that constrains space. The US can move the interest rate up or down. Context, if you deviate very far from that global norm set by the United States, you're going to trigger capital flows in and out, and that's very disruptive for an economy. So the US is calling the shots. The textbook handles monetary policy that way. The same does not apply in the emerging East Asia context. So the contents, there's a preface, an introductory chapter, an empirical overview, fundamentals of microeconomics, and then we move into the nuts and bolts of macro. So we start with national income and product accounts, and that's standard. You would do that anywhere, but we immediately follow that with the balance of payments accounts, so that we're connecting the domestic activity and external activity. Lays out about internal and external balance in tandem. We want to get to exchange rates, but before we can do that, we have to talk about money and we have to talk about finance. So those are the next two chapters. And then we get to exchange rates. So with these first 8 chapters, we're laying foundations. We're putting the tools in place. And then our 2 chapters for thinking about why economies fluctuate, why macroeconomic trajectories are not stable, why there's fluctuation up and down. And we have the standard models all compacted into one chapter. So income expenditure model, aggregate supply, aggregate demand, the ISLM model with the external dimension, all of that is compressed into one chapter. So if you've already before, you won't learn it seriously from this, but you'll get a sense, and you can move on with just a sense of how these models work and what variables go into these models. And then we look at business cycles, which in contrast to the models of chapter 9, we're looking at a dynamic process. The models of chapter 9 are comparative static models. Then we're ready for policy. So monetary policy, tailored to the emerging East Asia context, with the exchange rate as a key instrument in monetary policy, and then fiscal policy, and then we bring them together, policy for internal and external balance. We want to have both, and we have 2 policy arms for stabilization, monetary and fiscal policy, and we make them work balance. Then the macro-prudential policy, and it's interesting that Carlo mentioned that, because that came along long after I taught the course, but he's gone back and looked at it apparently. And then crises, and of course, we were in the midst of a crisis, and we still are in the tail of that crisis with the pandemic. So looking at both the real economy shocks like the pandemic and financial crises. Now, you'll notice that for most of these chapters, one economy in particular is featured for an in-depth illustration of the principles of the chapter. And there are also comparative static or comparative cross-section look of all the economies in most chapters. Okay, so the key thing that we build toward in thinking about policy in attention to policy space. With fiscal policy, that all stems from debt to GDP pressures. Depending on the starting point, countries may or may not have much room to take on more debt as a way of using fiscal policy stimulus by increasing spending and cutting taxes. So to think about space, we need three variables: the real interest rate, the GDP growth rate, real growth rate, and the initial debt to GDP ratio. And then we can derive a sustainability condition that will hold debt to GDP constant, as the expression on the right, with respect to the primary balance on the fiscal budget, which is the balance not counting interest payments on government debt. So we've by space for policy. Same with monetary policy. A stimulus will push interest rates down, and if you diverge too much from the global standards set by the US, capital will flow out, the value of your currency will drop, and it will become difficult to service external debt, both for the government and for private borrowers. So monetary policy space depends on the buoyancy of the domestic currency, and as that will be revealed by pressures on the exchange rate and how the central bank is intervening to stabilize the exchange rate. So the reserve item on the balance of payments will tell us that. So this frames the policy space. Now I've kept updating, since we're really in a time period where things are moving, and is all important as countries try to come out of the pandemic and the stimulus policies that everybody implemented. You back away from that, how much space do you have to continue? So I have a blog through the American Committee on Asian Economic Studies, the Asia Economics blog, where I'm continuing to provide work, and I got some links here, but if you don't have access to the links, it's easy enough to just Google Asia Economics blog and go there and find the updates. So for instructors, I'll continue to do this, and it's always tough to keep a course current, but I'm providing support for that. So what's happening right now? Well, interest rates are going up. And I'm looking in this chart at the interest rate on 10 due to governments having have increased their borrowing during the pandemic. And now the US, while it was doing the same thing initially, is now tightening up. It's reducing its deficit pretty rapidly and increasing interest rates through tighter monetary policy. So global capital is being drawn to the US, the higher interest rates there, and risk sentiment are becoming more adverse to Asia. So interest rates are rising. We can look at the Philippine case, and this is over not a long period of time. So July 21 is the first read. Interest rate on 10-year government bonds in the Philippines was under 4%. Now it's more like 7%. So borrowing, servicing debt has become a lot more expensive, and we're not, the US is raising interest rates. And if you look down the line across all these countries, it's pretty universal, but to varying degrees, except for China, because China's capital markets are much more closed, and domestically, they have ways of lending capital to the government through a state-owned banking system within a more of a contained environment that other economies do not have. This is an update, and the chart was done rather hurriedly, so I'm not ready to go public with it, but I'm going to work on this again and do a blog update looking at the latest figures for the first half of 2022. So we noted for the sustainability condition, taking the nominal rate and subtracting the projected rate of inflation, we get a real rate. The real GDP growth rate, again, projected, and the source is the IMF data on these projections, and the current debt to GDP ratio. And there's a great variation across economies. some are really pushing up against prudent limits, and others have a lot more space. Singapore is dropped from this chart because Singapore has a pretty high debt to GDP ratio, but it also has enormous government assets that are not all transparent. So it's not as meaningful to think about Singapore within this context as being constrained. Hong Kong obviously has all the space it wants. The Philippines in 2021, debt ratio is approaching 60. Getting borderline to where it probably is not a good idea to push a lot further, but we see that there are economies that have much higher ratios. So what's the sustainable primary balance to GDP that will preserve the debt to GDP ratio as it existed in 2021? That's the next column under primary balance to GDP, the sustainable rate. And we're going to compare that with the actual rate for 2021 as projected and projections on beyond. And where we see orange shading, that means they're exceeding the sustainable threshold for the primary balance to GDP ratio. And that means debt to GDP ratios will be rising. And we see that for almost everybody, 2022, the actual level of the deficit exceeds the sustainability threshold, and we know that. It was crisis time. There's a need for fiscal stimulus, but if you're pushing limits on debt to GDP, you need to think about rebalancing the government budget. And we see, looking out to next year and beyond, averaging across these 4 years, that for the most part, the economies in the sample are projected to come back to a sustainable level, including the Philippines. And so while the crisis has prompted extraordinary fiscal stimulus, we look to be moving beyond that in much of the region. The real big danger looking case is the China case, because debt to GDP is already high. Always China case, there is a lot of unfunded government potential liabilities that, for example, through state enterprises, through the state-owned financial system, that aren't included in this ratio, that make China's position even more dodgy. And they have far exceeded the sustainability condition and are projected to do so in years ahead. So debt levels in China are probably the most worrisome of all of the economies in this framework. Monetary policy space. This is a graphical framework that is developed in the book. So I had noted that in thinking about space, we need to look at two things. One is what's happening to the exchange rate, and the other is how much is the central bank intervening to influence that exchange rate. Is direction, depreciation moving to the right, and you don't, too much depreciation is a worrisome thing, because for those who have borrowed in foreign currency, it gets harder to repay debt. And then central bank intervention, this is change in reserves as observed through the balance of payments. So this is the central bank intervening in the foreign exchange market. And each of these 4 quadrants is labeled. What we see here in the first chart, and I'm going to move through time with this. First chart is 2020, and most of the economies in our sample are in the upper left quadrant, the northwest quadrant. And that's a really comfortable place to be. That's leaning against appreciation. So currencies are appreciating, and central banks are buying foreign currency. And they've got really comfortable policy space to stimulate the economy, even as their currencies continue to appreciate and the central banks continue to accumulate reserves. So they're in a very safe position in the upper left quadrant. And that's where most of our economies found themselves. in 2020. Well, what happened in 2021? The whole thing shifts to the right. So we see now currencies are depreciating, but central banks are leaning into that. They're still buying foreign currency, selling domestic currency. That's still expansionary, and they're comfortable enough with the amount of currency depreciation that they're not fighting it. Well, what happens by 2021 first half? Start moving down into the lower right quadrant. Now currencies are depreciating and central banks are leaning against that. That means they have to sell foreign currency, buy up domestic currency. And of course, there's a limit to how much foreign currency you can sell because you don't print it. Unlike domestic currency, you can sell as much of that or infuse as much of that into the economy as you want to. But foreign currency is limited. You got to prudently manage how much you sell, but you don't want your currency to depreciate either. So depreciating currencies, central banks leaning against that in 2022, and that's contractionary. They're tightening. They're reducing the size of the central bank balance sheet. So they've not got policy space anymore. They're fighting currency depreciation. They can't stimulate anymore. They're forced into a position of tightening. So this is it's developed in this book, and I think is a useful way to analyze what's happening in the emerging East Asia Center context. You don't get this in a US textbook. You have to use this textbook. So available soon. I had hoped that this would be a true launch and that we would have books available maybe the end of this month, the publisher is telling me. Cambridge University Press has a pre-order on their website, so that's one option, but and instructors can request a desk copy. Even the digital copy is not available for download yet, but when it is, that would be the quickest way if you want a desk copy to get one from the publisher. There will be a local vendor in the Philippines, C&E Publishing, and they do have actual physical book city distribute through Shopee, so they will set up ordering online when the book becomes available, and then there's also an Amazon Kindle option. So very soon, maybe end of November, early December, you can actually get the book for yourself. So that's it for my slides, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Calla, for giving us an overview of the book. And yeah, the way you've presented it makes me very excited to have my own copy of the book and use it when, well, the open economy macroeconomics. As he said, if you get the US textbook, the US is modeled as a closed economy, right? So it's not useful for small open economies like emerging economies like the Philippines. Thank you very much. I will come to the next discussant of your book, another former student of yours, Ms. Ana Eslava-Jimenez. As we mentioned earlier, she's a policy research officer 3 at the Philippine Competition Commission. Ana?
Thank you, Dr. Ducanes. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Calla. Thank you for inviting us and congrats on your book launching. Good afternoon to my fellow panel members and to all who are in attendance in today's session. So if you search for macroeconomics for emerging East Asia, the first two results would direct you to Cambridge University Press and Amazon websites. And as noted, one of the key features of the said book is that it sparks student interest in real-world policy issues and challenges through case studies on 13 emerging economies in Northeast and Southeast Asia. So I would studied my using a textbook with US being a case in point. And I was really enlightened when I read this book in which the East Asian economies, including the Philippines, were used as case studies and research focus. So for this session, I would like to briefly talk about the paper we wrote for the course in response to the knowledge we gained from studying the book. If you read the article written by Dr. Calla on the economics of pandemic, she mentioned how Singapore stands out for its extraordinary surge in spending. It was also noted that this was because the Singaporean government had the luxury of being able to spend freely without regard for borrowing costs, given substantial reserve funds accumulated through years of running budgetary surpluses. So, in our paper, hallmark of Singapore's fiscal policy, we noted the perpetual budget surplus with large foreign reserves and strong sovereign credit. Though despite a seemingly successful strategy, data we used in 2015 showed that Singapore government is not managing its budget as well. Constitutional fiscal rules, conservative targeting, duplicated tax collection measures. These were just some of the reasons why Singapore has been accumulating consistent budget surpluses over the years. Singapore's economic growth can be attributed to its open and outward-oriented strategy. Being an export-dependent economy, it developed its exports from labor-intensive to high value-added products. Growth also occurred in its services sector, as evidenced in the increasing market share of its financial and business sectors. Of equal importance to Singapore's economic success is its fiscal policies that strive to maintain a conducive environment for long-term investment in the economy. Rather than cyclical changes or income distribution, promoting long-term growth is the primary objective of the government. Nevertheless, Singapore's policymakers were no believers of Keynes, and rather than employing deficit spending, the Singapore government aimed to secure healthy budget surpluses over the years, which resulted to a robust fiscal position with high levels of foreign reserves. Singapore recorded consistent budget surpluses as percentage of its GDP from 1990 to 2014, except for 2009 when Singapore had a budget deficit by only 0.59% of GDP. So, the openness of the Singapore economy and its ability to export withstood external shocks. Despite this, Singapore was able to maintain budget surpluses even in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis and the bursting of the dot-com bubble. The Ministry of Finance stresses that its fiscal policy is primarily directed at promoting long-term economic growth rather than cyclical stability. Nonetheless, policymakers still rely on fiscal policy to counter the impact of adverse external shocks, as evidenced by the pronounced spikes in government outlays and dips in government revenues in 1998, 2001, 2009, and even during the pandemic. That said, why does the ministry persist on targeting budget surpluses, even smaller ones, during sharp economic contractions, knowing that fundamentally is a structural fiscal surplus is contractionary? Because the primary constraint is Singapore's constitutional fiscal rules. The Singapore Constitution contains three fiscal rules that serve as spending blocks and prohibit the government from accumulating budget deficits. So, given the constraints that Singapore has regarding its budget, the relative enormity of Singapore's budget surpluses need to be put into some perspective. According to the IMF, from 1990 to 2012, the average government revenue to expenditure ratio is 2.2. This means that the government only spends 4% of every $1 it took through tax. So to sustain a balanced budget, the Singapore government needs to manage its outlays in such a way that it only provides essential public goods and services for its citizens. But what the Singapore government spends largely on are services. So what is the point of saying all this? Because these were just some of the things that we could learn from Dr. Kalya's book. So it is highly recommended that we use our textbook as main resource in macroeconomics classes here in the Philippines, as we can relate to the discussions. The book talks about real scenarios for East Asian countries. So for that, I would like to thank Dr. Calla for working on it and also for encouraging your past students to participate in drafting the book, even in our own little ways. Again, congratulations and more power to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for giving us more insights into the book. Now we'll move on to Mr. Levi Geganzo. He's previously part of the Center for Integrative and Development Studies Political Economy Program and currently a school of.
Before anything else, thank you, Dr. Calla, for the invitation as one of your discussants for this afternoon. I'm really glad to see some of familiar faces here, especially my classmates in MDE, and of course, some of our teachers. And I am glad to be one of the first to read Dr. Calla's work. And I must say that it is a great read, especially for those who have a hard time studying or understanding macroeconomics. Um, I would not share that much about the book's content, or else everyone here would not buy a copy anymore. But I would say that Dr. Wiemer's work has covered vast topics that is beneficial in emerging economies like ours. The implications of every policy that we formulate, we have made or are yet to take. And it is especially important on my personal reflection that being part of the political economy program in UPC Ideas, UPCID, it seems like some policies that we actually undertake in the government sometimes do not really affect or I want to get away with the term trickle down, but really benefit some of our citizens. And also, in my current stint as a part of the Ateneo School of Government, we have this research on defense spending. And mind you, it was AFP's budget was actually affected greatly during part of it, and almost 97% of our budget for the modernization of our military against our external threats, especially those in West Philippine Sea and other issues, was actually affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this book actually gave me a better insight on how to actually explain this uh, to everyone, especially in our working papers. My personal favorite, and I must say, no, is chapter 15 on crisis. This is the second to the last chapter, where Dr. Calla's work has shown a thorough discussion on how crisis begins, its anatomy, what causes it, how policymakers respond, and the effects of these responses, and even our personal interests. Yet, we think that what we're doing actually collectively affect or could accelerate or hasten crisis. And Dr. Wiemer has covered these topics very well. And I hope to see more of that in the future. Dr. Wiemer has covered interesting cases on both financial crisis, particularly the Asian financial crisis that started in Thailand in 1997, and even the real economic shock of COVID-19 pandemics, which I also had experience working with some of the monetary and fiscal space, adjustments and researches. I always share the same sentiments with Dr. Wiemer on teaching or explaining macroeconomics from the standpoint of those who experience it. And that's what we do in our political economy program. And in this context and on her textbook, The Asian Context, economists like think more but kind words for Dr. Wiemer, and we need more economists providing more inclusive and holistic viewpoint of the economic thought. I wish to see more of Dr. Wiemer's work, and I must say that I actually did not finish the book because I'm a fan of IP rights, intellectual property rights. I want to buy a physical one. And I wish to see more of your work, ma'am, and hopefully a second edition. And for those who haven't checked it, also her blog on Asian Economic blog, I'm a fan of that. It's also another interesting site to check. Thank you very much. Thanks, Asik, Sarah. Thanks, Dr. Calla, and see you around Katipunan and UP Diliman. Salamat po.
Thank you very much, Levi. Your comment on respecting IP rights is well noted. Oh, so Mr. Dan Jimenez, Senior Economist at National Irrigation Administration and a Senior Lecturer at the University of the Philippines Diliman Extension Program in Pampanga, and whose better half is Anna, from whom we have already heard earlier. Take it away, Dan.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah. First off, before I start, very may we sorry. Yeah, warm round of applause for Dr. Calla. No, congratulations on your book, well put together book. It has a long and storied history, and that reflects, you know, just how much content is in the book. Obviously, I'm one of the more greener discussants this afternoon, but I'd like to relate to everyone here on a more personal note on how the book has changed my perspective as a student, as a learner of economics. In particular, how it has shifted my view of the East Asian economies for its uniqueness, for better or worse. And I'll walk you through some of just three things that I'd like to share with the Dr. Calla's book. Okay, so on the key features of the book, it says that it has a as Dr. Calla has stressed earlier, it most of our appreciation, most of our learning in macroeconomics has been shaped by the US perspective, the US lens, and most of that has had an inward focus, has an inward perspective. For example, they have unlimited space for fiscal space, unlimited source for expanding their budgets, which is hard to imagine to also be present or to also be achievable here in the emerging East Asian economies. So what that has inculcated, and I would admit to this when, especially when I was a younger student, is that I had this mercantilist, this myopic and view. So my ideal at that time was that we should be import substituting, totally self-reliant, and for goods and services that are considered essential, that trade played little in, short of a, for lack of a better word, in achieving society's goals. So with this book, with its internal and external focus, it helped us see truly what are unique here in the East Asian countries. For example, in the Philippine case, if we were to look at the difference between gross national income and also the GDP, on the average, difference of $32 billion, constant 2010 US dollars between the GDP and when the current account is taken into account or included in that accounting. It now shows the true size of the economy. And if we were to follow the pedagogy or the the limited focus that has traditionally been followed in other textbooks, we would limit our appreciation and our measurement of an economy just with the GDP and downplay the role of what the external openness does to an economy, how it affects everyone's daily lives, because that $32 billion annual uh, GNI really does um, shape how we are able, or the quality of life that the ordinary Filipino is living. Now, the book also has a focus on global capital flows, and it's treated as a force to be reckoned with. Chiefly among these is the book's discussion on the swan diagram. Um, there is a good focus here in the book for maintaining that internal balance and external balance by tempering unbridled expansionary fiscal spending or fiscal policy with external balance. So there is a good focus here in the book, and it lends us some view on how that is done. And downplays the importance of the external balance, except here for the book of Dr. Calla. We now get that perspective on how policy objectives must be construed while taking into account both fiscal, monetary, and so to speak, our internal and also external balance in setting national goals. Now, the next unique and, well, definitely positive aspect of this book is that it has an effective use of empirical charts. As we saw from the presentation of Dr. Calla earlier, she has frankly construed ingenious ways on how to in that the correct perspectives are shown. And it's effectively framed for us to draw deeper insights. This is an example here, with permission. I got permission from Dr. Cal just to show this for everyone. This is part of her book here in chapter 4. It shows the savings and investment rates of different East Asian economies, from Singapore, China, Taiwan, Korea, and then of course the Philippines. What I'd like to point out here is how she's with the presentation of the table here. Visually, we can appreciate the difference between the savings rate of these countries, and then juxtaposed to that is the investment rates that they have, and we can make comparisons because and um, well put together graph, the difference that, for example, Singapore may have with, say, the Philippines, which has the former having a massive saving as a percentage of their GDP. And in the case of the Philippines, the latter, with its saving rate falling well below of its investment requirements. And we can then further draw more insights or other insights on the other economies that are here in East Asia as well. So these are the kinds of empirical charts that are shown in the book, and this is just a taste of what's inside the book, of whatever insights that we can draw from this the data, arrangement of the data. I have another example here. This is from the chapter for business cycles, and this particular figure here shows the Minsky moment that had preceded major the collapse that had frankly characterized, unfortunately, what happened during the EDSA revolution. Now, from this data, we can see that when with the juxtaposition of the data here for financial institutional assets, foreign debt, and also GDP growth, we can see that these periods do coincide, and that the situation really was collapse. And that, of course, does not detract that the Miski moment was already a writing on the wall in the years before the collapse of 83 to 86. But again, this is a good use, or this is again an effective use of arrangement of data and also visual representations to lend its readers a good perspective of economic history and also economic data. We can imagine that if this were just written down in some table, or just haphazardly presented to the student, it would not be as and teaching for its readers. Now, lastly, when we were in talks with Dr. Calla for this panelist, for us to be panelists this afternoon, we were asked if we had any additions, maybe recommendations for future editions. I was first, because I read a previous manuscript for the book. My idea was that maybe we could add some more, or the discussion could be enriched if the impact of the pandemic would also be included in the book. Its particular stamp that it had left on the East Asian economies, its particular policy, fiscal policy, and also monetary policy. Well, frankly, constrained to be undertaken for the economies in emerging East Asia. That would be, of course, a worthwhile addition to the book. But on my more recent reading of the book, I think these have been included as well. Dr. Calla, your recent posts from the American. There, I've seen some sections. I think, but of course, with the most recent and well, still felt pangs of the pandemic, that would be a worthwhile addition here to the book. But also, although we do already see some of this in and growth accounting for emerging East Asia, this might be a good frontier for the book to also push further, maybe some more endogenous models, some recent literature into that, which is I'm sure Dr. Calla could weigh in on this as well. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening, and just the message that I'd like to give to everyone here is that there is a lot that we can learn from this book, in particular our perspective of the East Asian economies and their unique traits, as I said, for better or worse. Thank you, Dr. Calla, and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Dan. And perhaps later Calla can comment on the topics that should probably include in her next edition, in the next editions of the book. Okay, last but not the least, we have Dr. JC Punongbayan. As I said, very famous author at Rappler and an assistant professor, and currently the graduate director at the UP School of Economics. JC?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and nice to see you, Calla. Congratulations on the book. Well, first off, well, actually, I'm coming from Bali. I'm here in Bali to attend another conference, but I definitely wouldn't miss the book launch. I had the privilege of being Calla's student in Econ 209, graduate level history of economic thought. And we had a swell time with Calla, even if it was rather a small class. I remember the most the timeline that Calla down the dead economists that we were discussing in class, whose life and the works we were studying. And I also thought that Kalya's addition of a number of economists, including Budget and Minsky, was quite instructive insofar as these economists are not traditionally included in other subjects on history of economic thought. So definitely Kalya had that great value added in that class. So thank you very much. Okay, so I'll give a few thoughts about the book, which I really find very useful and very timely, especially now that I'm teaching macroeconomics at UPSE. And in fact, Sarah will be a lot more qualified to discuss teaching macroeconomics at UPSE. I only started, last year teaching Econ 101. But observations frustrating to have to deal with the Mankyo all the time, especially since Mankyo really fails to capture nuances that define Asian economies, specifically the Philippines. And some of these nuances include, for example, the pivotal role of exchange rates, balance of payments issues, as well as the singular role of remittances in the Philippines. There are also unique episodes in Asian economic history that actually serve to illustrate macroeconomics superbly, but are unfortunately not discussed in textbooks such as Mankyo, including, for example, the Asian financial crisis. Although there's a box there, but I think that episode deserves more treatment, especially in the famous macroeconomic texts. And then, of course, we have the uh, Philippine debt crisis and the economic crisis that followed that, which importance of this. As you know, during martial law, the central bank was really controlled by Marcos himself, and that led to the ironic bankruptcy of the central bank and led to the rebranding of the central bank into the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. So these episodes are really quite illustrative, but unfortunately are not captured so much in textbooks such as Mankyo. Now, to go around these limitations, at least before Calla's book, I found myself having to make an effort to link textbook macroeconomics to episodes in Philippine economic history. So, for example, in class, I discussed the history of the Philippine peso and US dollar exchange rate, the history of import substituting industrialization, as well as the premature deindustrialization of the Philippines. And then, of course, Marcos of payments crisis and the lost decades of development that followed the first Marcos administration. Actually, many students of UPSE really find these links to specific episodes in Philippine economic history really quite illustrative. And really, these things really should be covered in the references, and we're very glad that Calla's book really does that very well. Calla's book really fills that huge gap and definitely tackles many of these Asia and Philippine-centric issues. An example of that would be the section in the book, Minsky Moment of the 1980s, where really we need to look more into the institutional reasons for financial crisis and the Philippines very well. So, for example, Calla said in the book that economic growth then was propelled by mounting debt that passed the point of sustainability. And I mean, that's one of the key issues that Filipino students of macroeconomics really need to imbibe or take away from any macroeconomics class. So, I mean, the contextualization of macroeconomics issues in Calla's book is really very useful and very timely, especially now that, as Calla mentioned, the world is heading toward a global recession, possibly, and there's a lot of economic turmoil in the West. But we have to contrast that with what's happening here in our region of the world, and more broadly in the global South. So, for example, the US and the Eurozone are looking at a potential, but here in emerging East Asia. So, for example, just today it was announced by the government that the GDP grew by 7.6%, but that's amid a record 7.7% inflation rate. So, even if inflation is very high, the highest in nearly 14 years, and interest rates are rising, as Calla mentioned, so far, it's not denting GDP growth in the Philippines. So, I mean, we really need to contextualize and not think that if something happens in the West, that automatically happens in the East. And Calla's book really captures that kind of dynamic and the need for contextualization in discussing macroeconomics. Finally, just to say that really context brings macroeconomics to life. And Calla's new book is a great addition and supplement to the teaching of Philippines. Much look in my syllabi for Econ 101 and Econ 103 starting next semester. So Calla, congratulations again, and rest assured I'll be promoting your book to my economic teacher friends and colleagues. See you around campus and around Katipunan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, JC. And of course, to your tens of thousands of followers on Twitter and also Facebook, hundreds of
I'll share
thousands.
it.
Okay, thank you very much for your pointed insights on Calla's book. Now, do we have a response from our author, distinguished author, Calla?
I would like to thank all of my students for stepping up. I know I put you on the spot by asking you to come on this panel. You had to come on and say good things, and you did do that. And that some of you will be using this book in teaching because that's what it's for. And I myself, of course, was motivated to do this because I do believe that there's a need to teach economics in a way that is pertinent and relevant to this part of the world. And so I hope that my book will provide that. I suppose we're almost out of time. Is there an opportunity for questions?
Yes, we still have a few minutes for questions. So we now open the floor to any questions from the audience, from the rest of our participants. Yes, Ma'am Jovi.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you also for the opportunity, Professor Calla, to having us ask our questions. My question is, I have read some articles looking at integration, financial integration in Asia. In fact, I was doing that yesterday, and somehow they saw quite a lot of difference. In fact, a divergence in respect to financial integration. And what I'm worried about is that the Philippines is very far in terms of, shall we say, correlation, because they use correlation as a way of measuring integration, financial integration. So actually, it's the Philippines and Vietnam, very far from having a high correlation with the other East Asian nations. Ma'am, Professor, how would this, the article was highly statistical. How would this statistical result have an explanation from your book?
So you've said that the Philippines shows not so much correlation with financial fluctuations. Yeah. So it in the sense that you're not as exposed to shocks from global capital flows, and that may help with keeping the economy more stable. However, you lose out on a lot by not integrating with the rest of the world. And I think historically, in some of the charts that I looked at, and looking at the Philippines in the context of some of the Asian financial crisis, going back in time, Philippines was not as exposed because it wasn't as well integrated. So you have maybe a little more of a safe space against global fluctuations, but you miss out on all of the impetus to growth that engaging with trade and global capital flows can also bring. So it's a real mixed bag. And if you miss out on the long-term growth, but probably worse off in the long run from that.
Yes.
So being exposed to global capital flows and financial integration, you need to know how to stabilize the economy against that. And that's really what this book is aimed at imparting: a knowledge of stabilization policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, how to use those arms of policy to buffer the impact of external. And there's a chapter 2, as Carlo mentioned, and that is really beginning to come to the fore. Korea has effectively developed macroprudential tools, but economies that are at a lower stage of development can look to that experience, and that's an instrument too for buffering shocks from global capital flows.
Thank you so much.
In Calla, that looking at the Asian financial crisis and even in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, just before the Asian financial crisis, the run up to that, the aftermath of the global financial crisis, when East Asia experienced a lot of capital inflows. So for the Philippines, historically, we observed that in terms of FDI's portfolio investments, more so portfolio investments, we saw surges in these variables. But when we compare these surges that occurred in other Asian economies, it's these were very, very small with respect to the other Asian economies. So in that sense, when the Asian financial crisis happened, the Philippines was not as affected as the other Asian economies because, to risk, as you said. But then, by not being as exposed to that risk, it missed out on that high growth episode that a lot of these Asian economies experienced before the Asian financial crisis.
And a lot was learned from the Asian financial crisis. Maybe the Philippines did well to let that learning be done in other countries. And now the lessons from that in how to better regulate the financial sector and be prepared to deal with the inflows and outflows of capital.
Well, part of the narrative that said, well, for one, very small financial inflows with respect to other Asian economies. Well, on the positive side, what's being cited is that we've learned during the BOP crisis in the early 1980s. So that also helped us in dealing with the effects of the Asian financial crisis.
Yeah.
And of course, the lessons from the Asian financial crisis, also in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Thank you very much, Prof. Joby, for that question. We have other questions, comments, any questions regarding the book from the rest of our participants?
I have a question for Calla. Calla, what's your forecast for the region? I mean, given all the global headwinds with the global macroeconomy, what's your take on it? Where are we headed?
Well, I look at the way you region. The Philippines, like other economies in the region, is compelled to follow suit. So the governor of the Banco Central, Felipe Medalla, when he's asked, what are you going to do about interest rates? He says, well, it depends on what the US does about interest rates. And if the US raises interest rates, we have to follow. And that's true. So that's the whole case that my book makes, that the exposure to outside influences is going to determine a lot of your policy space and what can be done. So the US is tightening, and the Philippines also has to tighten. But the Philippines needs to tighten because inflation is a problem here too. The big injustice is that when the US tightens, the value of cheaper, and that helps to bring down the inflation rate. At the same time, the value of the peso and all of the other currencies in the region is falling, and that makes it more difficult to bring down inflation because imports are getting more expensive as the dollar rises and the peso falls here. So the US is able to really exploit the benefits of a tightening monetary policy, and with the Philippines, the impact of that is to impart an inflationary impulse because the peso's falling, imports are getting more expensive. So, at this point too, the US economy is still expanding pretty strongly. So that's a good driver for the rest of the world. But what that means is that the Fed has to tighten further, that we're not done yet, that direction of. And so if and when the US recession hits, and we keep seeing that this is kind of moving on down the road, but it's a tough judgment to make, how much to tighten, how much is too much, because there's a long lag in how it's going to play out. So we see in some sectors in the US, like housing construction, building construction, already the effects of tightening are hitting hard there. Housing prices are falling, construction starts are slowing. That's a sign that on down the road, the construction sector is going to suffer first. And we know that. It's very interest sensitive. So although we're all still feeling pretty good right now, that the US economy is growing, and that's driving global growth, they're baking into the cake already with monetary policy what is going to be happening a year from we're a little worried about that. And of course, China's not doing well, and the zero COVID policy is continuing to hold China back. The tensions between the US and China are problematic for the region. And so right now you're talking about 7% growth for the Philippines, but there was a contraction of 9.5%, so you're still kind of digging out of the hole to get back to a trend growth path. And good luck with that. I'm hoping for the best, but there are going to be a lot of headwinds coming. So, what you can do, and Dan was right. My book does not deal with long-term growth. It deals with fluctuations. And I was given a word limit of 130,000 words. I asked for 140,000, and Cambridge means something has to take away. And so for me, it was more important to focus on the short run, fluctuations and stabilization policy. Long run, but the Philippines do to improve structural position growth going forward. So there's a stabilization aspect, and there are headwinds coming there, but there are a lot of problems in the Philippines, and I think the top-notch economists in this country are now being given a strong hand and how things are going to work going forward, including Sarah right here with us. And so we got some good minds working on these problems, and they're being given the policy space to implement a vision that I think is very promising for the Philippines.
For that, we're all awaiting the Philippine development plans in December. So stay tuned for that. Yeah, so we have time for one more question from the rest of our participants. Is there another question? All right, if there's none, Calla, oh, yes, Prof. Jovi. Yes,
So
please.
sorry. I'll take advantage, no? Because a while ago, there was a portion in the slides that Professor Calla said that in the Philippines, or actually in East Asia, no, unemployment is not really so much of a problem. However, a while ago, yeah, not so much.
No,
Yeah.
let me
I'm so
clarify.
sorry.
Let
Yeah,
me
okay.
clarify what I said.
Yes.
Not of economic performance, of fluctuations, as it is in the US. We're able to measure it very precisely and in a meaningful way. But in the Philippines, what you measure is as unemployment rate is not a meaningful thing in terms of macroeconomic fluctuations. Because you have a large informal sector, how do you count unemployment when such a large informal sector and agricultural pool of people who are employed at low productivity? It's just not a good indicator of where you are in the business cycle. That's what I meant to say. Not that unemployment isn't important, it is, but the unemployment rate is not a very useful indicator of the business cycle.
So would you say then that underemployment would be a better measure given or poverty, for instance? So
What I fall back on is economic growth potential. Is the economy growing at its potential? Potential is a really hard thing to measure. The IMF does give us indicators of that. The only way you really know where potential is to exceed it and run into inflationary problems. We have seen countries at the Philippine stage of development grow at 7, 8, 9, even 10%. And it not be inflationary. So it's really a matter of getting to potential. Disregard the unemployment rate. It doesn't tell you what your potential is. It does tell the United States where they are relative to potential. It doesn't tell the Philippines anything about where the economy is relative to potential. So it's kind of a test. See how fast economy can grow with whatever stimulus you're giving without it becoming inflationary. And that's how you know where potential is. But the unemployment rate, it's not going to tell you that. So the framing in my book is all about growth relative to potential.
Yes.
So you think the Okun's law is not relevant as well?
No, because that relies on measuring the unemployment rate. I don't think it's a simple concept here.
Yes.
From the standpoint of macroeconomic stabilization, which is not to say that unemployment isn't important. Unemployment is important. Underemployment is also hugely important. Informal sector capture of people at low productivity, that's important.
I have just a quick
Yeah.
Calla, to what extent do you think the Philippine government should defend the peso? Right now, they're defending it to some extent, but to what, I mean, is that sustainable? I mean, to what extent can that be done?
Limit on it, on defending the peso, is that you have to sell dollars. And you have a limit of how much you have in dollars. And you obviously don't want to draw down to the limit. You want to keep a healthy reserve. So that's really going to be the defining factor of what is a prudent level of reserves to keep on hand. But depreciation of the peso has its drawbacks as well. The most obvious one being the difficulty in repaying debt. Now, it's a good thing for selling your exports, and that helps to stimulate the borrowers are not hedged against depreciation of the peso, that it puts a real strain. So, I mean, those are the things that you have to balance. I'm glad I'm not the one in charge. I'm just speaking from an academic, abstract standpoint on what you have to look at.
We leave that to Sarah and the other UPSC economists.
No, it's that's under the purview of the BSP.
Ayun, yeah, exactly.
You know,
Unenviable.
every central bank, including the US central bank, relies heavily on judgment. And they get it wrong, you know, and we won't know for another year how the US central bank is doing right now. I mean,
It's true.
the inflation rate way overshot what the majority of economists in the United States thought was coming down the pike. Management. There were a lot of advocates for very expansionary monetary policy. A few voices like Larry Summers saying, we've already overdone it. We're injecting too much spending into the economy and accommodating that with monetary policy. We're going to have inflation. And Larry Summers, not the first time, was right about that. And many others were wrong about that. But it's a judgment, you know, and you're relying on a few individuals at a central bank who have to make that judgment. Not an easy job.
Yes, with that, Calla, again, congratulations on your book, and we really look forward to having a copy of the book. As you said, at the end of the month, we expect to be published for purchasing online. Although you mentioned earlier that just advance copies or purchase in advance.
Pre-order,
from
you can pre-order, yeah.
Pre-order.
Not yet through the local vendor.
Okay, yes, just online.
So you might as well wait till you can get it locally, which I don't think will be much of a delay, rather than paying shipping costs, unless you're so eager that you want to pay shipping costs.
Or for those who prefer reading them on their pet Kindle or tablets, can also purchase an online copy much earlier.
That's right.
All right. So again, congratulations, and thank you very much, Calla, for imparting your knowledge in the form of this book, and to all of AC Levi and who had to leave early. And for the rest of our participants, thank you very much for this very wonderful opportunity to discuss Dr. Calla Wiemer's book. Before we leave, let's please have a photo op. Please turn on your videos.
Okay.
And Patricia, will you be taking the photo?
Yes, ma'am. I'll take the screenshot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Everyone, please open your camera if you can. 1, 2. One more po. 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay na po. Thank you.
Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Congrats.